We're just continuing this session, the morning session on functional neurological symptoms and nocebo-placebo. And our next speaker, I'm really pleased to welcome Johannes Jungilligens, who is a clinical neuropsychologist and a neuroscientist at Bochum in the Ruhr Valley or area of Germany. And he's come over here to talk to us about a fascinating area of research he's involved with about the emotion connection with FND and functional symptoms more broadly, and published a very high impact paper in Brain that links up a lot of this work with the work of Feldman Barrett. And it's obviously work that's sort of many others have done in this area as well, but it's sort of taking it on to a new area and really getting this out known by people. So we're really grateful for you to come to talk today about this fascinating topic. So thank you, Johannes, for coming.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Tim. It's really good to be here today and to be able to talk about the new science of emotion. I'm not sure if we can see the slides yet, or we can make them appear. Okay, great. So these are my conflicts of interest, which are non-existing really. And as Tim just introduced, I'm from Germany. And as you might have heard, as Germans, we only really feel at ease once we have a certain structure to things. So I'm going to impose a certain structure on this talk, which is split into two parts, reflected in the title here. So in the first part, we are going to think about a new way of understanding what emotions are. And then I want to think a bit about what the implications for understanding FND are. So let's get right to it in part one, a new science of emotion. And I want to start with two very basic questions. And the first very basic question is, why should we talk about emotion when we're thinking about FND at all? And one of the answers to that is that, well, this has been a theme that has been brought into different kinds of conceptualizations of how to understand FND or hysteria or conversion disorder, or however we or the researchers and clinicians back then used to call it, to understand it. And there has been an evolving understanding, and I think one of the areas or one of the publications most impactful on my line of thinking was the 2018 paper headed by Susanna Pick, but also including Laura Goldstein, Tim Nicholson, and David Perez about the emotion or the role of emotion processing in functional neurological disorder. And here they propose that altered emotional processing may represent a key link between psychosocial risk factors on the one hand and core features of FND on the other hand. So issues like adverse life experiences and symptoms of FND. And it was very impactful on how I understood FND and functional seizures in particular. But it still left me wondering with another second question, which has largely been ignored, which is, what are emotion, or what is an emotion, and what do we mean when we talk about emotion processing really? Because it feels just so intuitive, right? There is something happening in the world, and then in your brain there is an event, an emotion forming. And then the brain has, or we as psychologists, we assume that the brain has certain tools at hand to process this emotion, or somewhere in the frontal lobe there are tools to regulate the emotion until it's not an emotion anymore, or something else, or whatever. And then we are used to thinking about emotions in terms of these 6 core emotions that are assumed to be the same in every human being and form the basis of our emotional life. And they are depicted here in these Ekman phases. And this idea, it carries on throughout our cultural narratives, from the ancient Greek theater, where the animalistic emotional beast fought against the rational human being. And in case the emotional side, the animalistic side won, you might be prone to suffering from psychiatric disorder. And it carries on until today, and until the kids' movies, children's movies like this 2015 Pixar movie, Inside Out, where the emotions are actually depicted by these 5 little guys, these 5 little figures inside a little girl's head, which steer her throughout the world with all the chaos associated with, well, emotional being. And then we've learned throughout psychology that this is, presumably at least, the same for every person all around the world. So no matter where you grew up, whether you grew up in a Western society or somewhere else entirely, this is the same thing. So these emotional facets are the same thing all around the world. But what if we just start to assume that all of this is not actually how it is? What if we think about that emotions might be something different. Because there is growing evidence across a range of cognitive affective neuroscience areas that those assumed core categories of emotions are just derived from folk categories from Western cultures, that psychologists and neuroscientists and whoever thought about emotions really just took their own experience from a Western standpoint and projected it on the world that they were trying to investigate. And that actually, when you compare emotional being or emotional feeling from around the world, you end up not having the same emotional experiences in all people all around the world, but they might differ in how they experience certain emotion or what emotion they experience in what circumstances. And there is a great paper published in Science 2019 where the researchers investigated the meaning of emotional words across 2,500 languages all around the world. And they found that there was significant variation in the meaning of those emotion words, so the emotion colexification networks. But they did find that there was an underlying general structure to all of those emotion words across all languages, which were reflected in the hedonic valence, so is it a good feeling emotion or a bad feeling emotion, and on the physiological arousal, so how arousing is this emotional state. And so across a domain or across several domains of measurement, we find that actually those emotional categories that we assumed were discrete are not as reliably identifiable by specific behavioral patterns, so how we behave or how people behave or what behavior they show, or regarding their physiological underpinnings. So whether we use fMRI, EEG, peripheral measurements, it's not as clear-cut as we would assume it would be if those emotions were as discretely as we assumed it. So we always find a huge variability within those categories and huge or significant similarities across those categories. And so this might be attributable to a psychological top-down approach, so that we as psychologists and other neuroscientists just took what we thought we knew about emotions from our own experiences and went on going looking for their neurobasis, their biological basis in the brain. And as ever so often, when you start looking for something, you will turn up with some kind of result. And so you end up with a fear center of the brain or an anger-related network or some kind of a neurological, biological substrate of a certain set of emotions. But maybe if we really want to understand what emotions are, we should turn this around. So really start at the brain basis, look at how the brain works and how it does its job, and to work our way upwards to see where we end up when we think about emotions then. And there has been a range of approaches who followed this line of thinking, including one which I will use today, the theory of constructed emotion put forward by Feldman Barrett, but there have been other similar approaches. And I want to use this as a framework to explore what emotions really are, or what we might understand emotions in 2023, and how this reflects on neuropsychiatric disorders, including FND. And we're going to start at the brain basis with one of the core functions of the brain, which is to keep ourselves alive, to help to regulate the body to ensure that we keep on living. Because basically, all human beings and all other animals need a system that orchestrates how their body is doing, because all bodies or all organisms need to obtain energy, need to store the energy, need to use the energy efficiently, and to do a whole lot of other things just to keep being alive. And you can basically understand the brain as the conductor, the principal manager of this always-on supply and demand challenge. And this conductor really orchestrates this whole process so that you hear a beautiful symphony instead of just random noise. And the process, which is basically managing all this, is referred to as allostasis. So it's an active process of forecasting what the body will need and then trying to meet those needs before you run into a critical situation, before you starve, before you can't breathe anymore, before any of those needs really manifest. And in that, it's not only concerned with energy intake, not only with your glucose levels, but with all the other functions, with your endocrine system, with breathing, with temperature, with blood pressure, with just everything, all those different systems that are there to keep your body alive. And in that, allostasis is actually different from homeostasis, where homeostasis is the process of bringing a system back to a set point as after a stressor occurs, whereas allostasis really is concerned with the long-term survival, the long-term metabolic efficiency of a system or the body. And to do that, the brain needs certain information about how the body is doing. So it relies on information about the state of the body in the form of a model of the body, so how the body is doing currently, and other salient contextual information which might impact how your body is doing. And to stay in that picture of the conductor conducting the orchestra, the conductor needs to hear how the different instruments are playing in order to make some instrument a little bit louder, to calm some other instruments down, to really keep them playing a beautiful symphony. And this information, which is coming up to help the brain regulate the body, is referred to as interoception. So the brain's moment-to-moment modeling of the internal state of the body, of how the body is doing. And that works to support allostasis, to really help the body keep on living, to manage the body well. And we tap into these interoceptive information at times using stuff like heartbeat monitoring or breathing monitoring, but really most of interoception takes place outside of awareness. So it's nothing that you can really be aware of. But what you are aware of is one of the results of interoception, which is referred to as affect. So that's like a moment-to-moment characterization, a broad modeling of how the body is doing. And it's an ever-present feature, and it permeates consciousness and how we perceive the world. And affect is divided into, or consists of two core properties, valence and arousal. And you might remember a few slides back, these were the exact same axes that came up across all those different emotion words all around the world as the underlying axes on how to differentiate emotions. And affect thus serves as basically a broad subjective barometer of how we're doing, of the energetic state of the body, and it influences how we perceive the world, because perceiving the world is always related to managing the needs of your body. And when we're talking about perceiving the world, obviously we have to bring in predictive processing frameworks, as we've heard about so much today, because the brain predicts the future always, in part to be able to efficiently regulate the body long term. And when we're talking about predictive processing frameworks, I really quickly want to bring in the key principles, even though I'm sure most of you or all of you will be very familiar with this, but they will keep coming up throughout the next slide, so just to make sure. So the first principle is that the brain is always predicting the future, and that's not as in, oh, I will need a raincoat this afternoon, but it's really on a millisecond to second basis on what will happen next in the world. And these predictions are actually based on our life experiences. So how the world was before and how these life experiences can inform our predictions of how the world will be in the future. And these predictions are then compared to the actually incoming sensory input. And in case there is a mismatch, a prediction error occurs, which tracks the difference between what we expected and what then occurred really, which is then used to update our life experiences. So to make a better prediction next time, because you've learned, okay, the prediction was not as accurate as we would have thought. And then the third principles are precision signals, which weigh those predictions and prediction errors, because not all of them are made equal, because some predictions and some errors are more relevant to be learned, to be integrated, and others can just be discarded. And those three processes that I've just introduced before, so allostasis, but also interoception and affect, they are also predictive. So allostasis is a predictive process of trying to manage your body before the needs arise. Interoception is predictive because it relies on comparing a predictive model of how your body is doing to the actual interoceptive input. And affect colors those predictions. So the way we perceive the world, the way we categorize emotions, the way we categorize sensory input is also reliant on how our body is doing in that very moment. And all of those, and now it gets a little bit into the nitty-gritty underlying it, is implemented in the computation hierarchies of the brain. So when we're looking at how the brain processes information, then we can see that the sensory input starts obviously at the primary sensory cortices, such as the primary visual cortex or the primary sensory cortices, and then it makes its way down through the secondary visual cortex and so on. It gets way and way more multimodal enrichment, and it gets way and way more abstract throughout this processing stream. And when we track these processing streams, we can see that they actually are reflected in the cortical hierarchies, or the microstructure of the cortex, where the most differentiated areas of the cortex are those coniocortical areas with 6 differentiated layers of cells. And going along this sensory fugal axis, so away from the sensory input, as there is a decreasing modality specificity, the underlying cortex, which is responsible for processing the information, gets more and more granular until you end up in the limbic cortices, so the most abstracted version of those sensory inputs lays in the limbic cortices. So you can think of information as beginning as really concrete and detailed, but then to go across intermediate states into a really abstract representation of the world. And if we're mapping these different kinds of cortices onto the surface of the brain, and we're using the latest imaging and neurophysiology methods, then we can actually see that not only the sensory input works its way down, but we can also understand that the predictions start at the other end of this sensory fugal axis and work their way upwards to be compared to the incoming sensory input at every step. And so those predictions actually start at an abstracted level in the limbic areas of the brain. Now, I've just said that the information is represented rather abstracted as the basis of these predictions. And the way they are represented there are in the form of abstract concepts. And these concepts are there to categorize, to give meaning to the incoming sensory input. So if I'm showing you this picture right now, then I'm sure most of you will only see like huge dark areas and then a few white spots between that. And what your brain is currently doing is it's trying to draw on your life experiences to fill the blanks here, to see what is happening, to give meaning to this sensory input. And presumably there is not much to draw on because you've never learned what this input could relate to. And no worries, I'm going to cure you from this in a second. But before that, I want to use this example to illustrate how those predictions actually help us, or how these concepts help us to understand the incoming sensory input, because the incoming sensory information is compared to features that have already been classified in case they have. And so they help us to understand what the meaning of that is. And that helps us to use those past experiences in the form of abstracted concepts to deal with the incoming sensory input. And it doesn't do that in the form of episodic memory, so you don't draw on what was or how was the last time that I encountered that stimulus, but you do it in an abstracted version, so an abstracted version of your life experiences in the form of concepts. So those concepts, they are abstract mental representations which contain the meaning of the sensory input, the implications for what your body is doing or how your body is doing, and in some cases they also have a plan how to deal with this sensory input, what it means and how to confront it and an associated action or motor plan. And also these concepts are used to regulate your body, as once again, one of the core ideas is that you use everything to keep yourself alive. And in that way, concepts are embodied representations because they also contain a meaning for the state of the body. And those concepts are at the core of predictions. So if a prediction, so one of those embodied concepts, matches the incoming sensory input, then similar features from the past are pieced together, are basically made into a new ad hoc representation to give sense to what you're experiencing in the world right now. However, as it was before, you can be in the situation where the incoming sensory input is actually not related to any given concept that you have at hand. So you cannot categorize it, and and the implications for allostasis are unclear. So you are experientially blind, as it is with this, well, let's call it a picture. However, if I'm going to cure you from this, and you can see that it's a dangerous monster running towards you in the woods, and you can encode this information and you enrich your conceptual knowledge, and then I'm going back to the black and white version, your brain is now filling in the blanks. It's the same visual input as before, but now in part you can see the teeth, you can see the claws, you can maybe see the eye, and next time you see something like that, you will have a concept of what that input shows. And maybe if you encounter something like that in the woods, you would also have an associated action plan, which would be going away rather quickly. Now, it's not always monsters that we classify, obviously. If we are looking at, like, for example, an apple, and I have to classify this input, then I could just draw on the concept of, well, that's an apple. Or maybe a kid which is just growing up and trying to understand the world could draw on the idea, well, that is an apple. And I can classify that, it's correct. I can think about what I can do to an apple or can do with an apple. But then as I'm growing older, or maybe I don't know, I work in retail, I can start to differentiate my concepts. I can start to understand, well, okay, that's Red Delicious, and that's different from Macintosh or Granny Smith. I don't know what that apple is, but there are different kinds of apples, and you can learn those concepts. They can get more granular. And that's really important because emotions are abstract concepts too. And they are there to give meaning, an emotional meaning, to sensory input. So when you use an emotion as a reference category to categorize the actual sensory input or the situation or the feeling that you're having, then a category for an emotion is constructed. However, if another concept is used to explain the very same sensory input, for example, you're using a non-emotional concept like exhaustion instead of sadness, then not an emotion would be constructed, but a bodily experience would be constructed. And the same is true with, for example, if you're referring to illness concepts or trauma concepts or other broader bodily concepts, which may be used to explain the very same sensory input that might explain emotion concepts. And as with apples, it is with emotions. So emotions are learned, or emotion concepts are learned or not, just as any other concepts. So when we're coming to this world as newborns, there's really just a mess of sensory input raining down on us, and we can't really make sense of that. And through growing up, we learn to categorize this input. We learn to make sense of the world by establishing and growing a concept repertoire which enables us to make sense, to have a signal in the noise. And by learning that, some of those concepts might actually be more adaptive to explain how we're doing and what we need and how we can tackle those needs compared to others. So early life experiences and interaction with our caregivers hopefully should help us curate those concepts which are most adaptive, most useful to build concepts related to what we need, what our bodies needs. And so in that, those social, cultural and environmental factors actually transmit kind of, generational transmission of emotion concepts in the form of a supervised category learning. So a statistical learning of associating certain states or certain sensory input to certain emotion concept or other concepts. So in case a baby is crying, the caregiver might go to it, and depending on context, the caregiver might say, oh, I see you're hungry, so I'm going to give you some food now. So there's a concept and an associated action plan. Whereas in another context, the caregiver might say, oh yeah, I see you're afraid because of that strange person over there. So through these interactions, we're building and we're establishing a concept of what that situation is and how to deal with it. However, when we're talking about these conceptual developments, we also, and the interaction with caregivers, we also have to bring in the role of adverse life experiences, because especially in those critical developmental periods, life experience and adverse life experiences are also foundational to which concepts we establish to explain the world around us. So in case we grow up in a highly threatening or a neglectful environment, then we might learn some concepts that are adaptive then to explain this environment and to explain how to deal with that environment, but they can last. So we can be stuck with those concepts even though the environment might have changed. Where 20 years later, the environment is not threatening or neglectful anymore, but we're still using the very same concepts. And those concepts might, for example, have more of a fight or flight component attached to them, so a motor component instead of being observed as a self-referential emotional state. Okay, yeah, I'm afraid right now. And that maps very nicely on this great paper by Leah Ludwig and her colleagues, who found that in patients with FND, childhood emotional neglect was the most common, by far the most common form of adverse life experience in childhood in FND patients. Now, once again, returning to the idea that emotions are abstract concepts and might be present in different granularities, I might be able, and that biopsychosocial factors actually play a role in how we develop these. I might have a concept of, well, I'm just not feeling well right now, or I might have differentiated versions of concepts, like, okay, I feel alarmed right now, or I feel frightened or distressed, and have slightly different meaning and ways of coping attached to those concepts. So, to really tie it all together, the brain constructs instances of emotion to give meaning to input and to prepare action, to prepare us how to deal with that. And it does that by relying on our life experiences in the form of abstract concepts, which are stored at the very end of this sensory-fugal axis in regions which closely overlap with parts of the default mode network. And those precision signals, which weigh our predictions and the prediction errors, are actually coming from regions which are part of the salience network, so which denote which information is salient versus other information. And as those predictions travel along these cortical hierarchies, they gain visceromotor aspects, so to regulate our body, to deal with it. They gain motor plans, and they gain affective properties. So basically, an emotion is made when an emotion concept is used to categorize the physical signals, give them an emotional meaning, and to render this experience an instance of that very specific emotion, depending on what emotion concept I was referring to. So, what have we talked about so far? The brain regulates the body. One of the core functions of the brain is to keep you alive. And it does that in part by predicting the future based on abstract concepts, so abstracted life experiences. And some of those abstract concepts are emotions, which are used to construct instances of emotion in case those are the concepts most closely at hand to explaining the input or the situation. So now let's turn to part 2, the implications for FND. And I want to structure this into basically 5 different proposals. So the first proposal would be that some symptoms of FND might reflect the chronic difficulties in energy management that some of those patients experience. For example, through the use of inefficient emotion concept or the inefficient use of concepts overall. So we know that fatigue and hyperarousal are 2 of the core properties or core symptoms very important to many patients with FND, as also identified in this wonderful study by Matt Butler, where 93% of patients actually said, well, yes, I do suffer from fatigue. And this might be a reflection of a chronic difficulty in energy management, where maybe there is just not a very granular concept available to manage your body, but it's really just basically being all the way somewhere between aroused and fatigued all the time. Second is that some symptoms of FND might occur due to deficits in emotion construction. So some symptoms might be reflecting the fact that there are no available or no emotion concepts available to explain something. So there's just the relationship to, oh, something is wrong or there's an illness concept at hand to explain that, or that this is not always the case, so there's not a chronic disability to use emotion concepts, but really that in some situations, maybe in states of high arousal, negative affect, those concepts are not the one, like the go-to explanation. So the problem might be constructing an emotion in one particular instance. The third proposal is that in many neuropsychiatric disorders, including FND, there might be a problem with learning from your prediction errors. So to integrating those prediction errors and updating the models you run all your processes on. So basically, you're stuck with using inefficient allostatic or interoceptive models, which might overlap with the findings, or which could overlap with the findings of alterations, structural and functional alterations in salience network regions, as we find using neuroimaging. And it also fits to the knowledge that in some patients with FND, we find deficits in sensory processing, in interoceptive accuracy. We find biased attention and alterations in motor learning, which might all be related to running outdated or having outdated models, or having problems updating your models based on prediction error learning. The fourth proposal is that some of the overarching themes that we've heard throughout this conference yesterday in some great talks, but also throughout the different conceptualizations of a range of neuropsychiatric disorders, something like alexithymia, and more specific to FND, panic without panic, can be reframed using this updated understanding of what emotions are. So alexithymia could be the limited availability of granular emotion concepts to explain sensory input. So in efficient and inefficient contextualization of the sensory input, whereas panic without panic, so the idea introduced by Laura Goldstein and John Mellors that some patients with functional seizures experience panic symptoms without the accompanying feeling of I am panicking right now, could actually be an instance of where an emotion is not constructed where it would be in other people. And lastly, the fifth proposal is going back to the idea of how biopsychosocial factors, specifically those social factors, influence in the form of life experiences, especially in critical developmental periods, how and what concepts we form. And that concepts that we form in the face of adversity might be something that we just carry on and might not be adaptive later in life, but still are the basis of how we explain the world. So all of what I've just talked about is not just something that I made up to be able to give a talk at this conference here, but it's something that we've been able to publish in Brain last year. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, please do feel invited to refer to that paper. I want to leave you with some caveats, though. So the first caveat is that this is not a one-size-fits-all framework. It's not attempting to explain all the different features of FND, but it's attempting to re-conceptualize, to understand the role of emotions in the pathophysiology of FND. And about exactly 10 years earlier previous to our paper, there has been this landmark paper published by Mark Edwards and Rick Adams and colleagues introducing the overall idea of predictive processing in functional neurological disorders, using a model of hierarchical Bayesian inference to explain functional and motor sensory symptoms. And I always understood that really the symptom part here is really key to understanding that model, based on inferences on prior beliefs and sensory information. So a really impactful line of thinking, also impacting our paper here, obviously. And that we understand our paper more as providing insight into some mechanisms in people or in people with FND, most importantly in those who report alexithymia, panic without panic, a broader range of comorbid psychopathologies, fatigue, and a high burden of early life adversity. So I would not understand these two and other approaches as mutually exclusive, but I rather really think that they are complementing each other, that in some patients there might be a really high part of the explanation of why this patient suffers from functional symptoms based on the mechanisms proposed by Mark Edwards and colleagues, whereas in other patients, our framework might have more explanatory power. And then there might be other groups of patients in which both frameworks, or none of these frameworks really, play a role in explaining why they develop these symptoms. And lastly, obviously, there are more lines of research, and there might be another great paper yet to be written, maybe by some of you, on another mechanism which might enlighten us about why patients suffer or start suffering and keep suffering from functional neurological disorder. The last caveat is that this is not at all a specific framework. So the principles that I've just talked about are not at all specific to FND, but really are a general predisposing vulnerability to develop any kind of psychopathology or neuropsychiatric disorder. And there have been other great approaches. So I want to highlight this paper on the role of allostasis and affect in depression, published last year, but also in the field of, well, about functional neurological disorder. This great paper by Feldman Barrett and also led by Richard Brown, which used a similar approach to others for the broader field of medically unexplained symptoms. And I do think that, or I do want to highlight that especially the use of body or illness-focused concepts and the role of adverse life experiences might actually be more specific to FND than to other neuropsychiatric disorders. So I want to close this talk, and I recognize I'm being a bit early here, but I want to close this talk by really highlighting the team behind this effort. I want to thank Sara Paredes Echeverri, who has been the co-first author of this paper. She's a postdoc at Mass General, Harvard Medical School. I want to thank Stoyan Popkirov, who's a long-standing colleague of mine in Bochum. And I really want to highlight the role of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's not only put out the theory of constructed emotion, but was really also a great co-author, and I've learned a lot from her lines of work throughout writing this paper. And most importantly, I want to highlight the role of David Perez, who's the head of the Mass General Functional Neurological Disorder Clinic and Research Program in Boston, who's been a great friend and mentor ever since I was able to join his team. And I most notably want to thank you for your kind interest and your attention. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Johannes. It was a truly exceptional talk, brilliantly clear on a very complex topic, putting together so many aspects. The fact you can do this in a second language sort of slightly blows my mind, actually, that I couldn't do it as well, even in my own. So, and finishing on time, so many other great things to note. So, questions from the audience and then online. So there's two up there, one in the middle was first. I don't know if sorry, it's Ella, isn't it? Hi, if you could, someone get a microphone. And also we've got lots of time for questions, which is
thanks for the really great talk. I wondered, with the adverse life experiences, particularly those in early childhood, is it thought that those are static over time, i.e. you can't modify the kind of subsequent prognosis, or are they thought to be modifiable and therefore could be targeted to prevent FND or kind of psychopathology in the future?
I do think that they are modifiable. I don't think that you are just stuck with them all your life. And that's the whole point of why we're doing all this, right? Part of psychotherapy, part of our treatments might be to moderate or to change the effects of those early life adversities. So no, you're not stuck with them and you can't do anything about it, not at all. I do think that some of those experiences might be so impactful that they really leave a mark on how you see the world, how you process the world, including what concepts you use. And psychotherapy might actually be the setting where you develop another kind of explanation, another concept, for example, some emotion concepts in the first place, because maybe you haven't just grown up being able to develop these kinds of concepts. So I think, yeah, that would be part of the answer.
Great. Whilst you're going up to the person with the white shirt, and we'll come back to John, but in the meantime, we've got a question online from Narinder Kapoor. Excellent talk. Do you think your model applies equally to motor sensory seizure manifestations and to functional cognitive disorder, or does the latter need a special framework?
That is a really interesting question. I do think that it might play a role in different kinds of functional neurological disorder. I do think that functional cognitive disorder is in many ways something special, something like slightly different from other forms of functional neurological disorder. And so I would not see a direct explanation or like a go-to explanation. I would have to think a bit about this. I do think that, being prone to, directing your attention to maybe something that goes wrong or something that is threatening you or something like that must not per se be related to what concept you use, but might be one of the mechanisms shared in both formulations of how you perceive the world and maybe also how you think about your own cognitive functions. So maybe something like that.
Brilliant. So if we could the chap with the white shirt, and then we've got John, but if John could then pass the microphone along to both Jeremy and Mark about this last question, because we might get all their, amazingly we've got a coalescence of experts on exactly that last topic about cognitive disorders. So yeah, chap with the white shirt.
Thank you for your very clear and very interesting talk. There's some interesting evidence to sort of link prediction error to negative valence states. So particularly in the dorsal anterior insula with manic states or ecstatic seizures, where there's a kind of false sense of insight and a clear sort of error blindness. But at the same time, there's also kind of a top-down negative valence thing where if you expect to feel sad, you will feel sad. And sometimes there's a kind of anxiety around not feeling how you expect to feel. So is there a kind of a top-down and a bottom-up kind of component to valence? And how's that relevant to FND, where you might kind of be stuck where you expect to feel sad, but not feeling how you expect to feel can also hurt in a way?
That is, I think, a very interesting question. So I think that all of these processes are kind of mixing these different bottom-up and top-down processing streams. So they are relevant in both cases. I think the mismatch between how you expect to feel something and how you're really feeling might be on a more abstract level than on those prediction error processing levels, but it's more on a cognitive level where you really start thinking about, oh, I assumed I would feel sad now, but I don't. What is wrong with me? And that might kick off just like another cascade. And I do think that, especially, for example, for functional seizures, there's more to the picture than just not feeling right, but there is some kind of like an underlying autonomic arousal kind of issue that is maybe not reflected on these conceptual levels. I don't know if that really answers that, but yeah.
John.
Thanks. That was absolutely brilliant. While we're dismantling folklore concepts of emotions, I wonder if there's another hierarchy to dismantle here, which is the idea that emotions are at the top and physical symptoms are underneath. Because if someone is feeling exhausted, and they feel exhausted, there's a general tendency to feel, well, perhaps we should help them by explaining that they're actually depressed. Whereas I think the model that you've got here allows that to go in both directions, and that perhaps being exhausted is on a sort of level with feeling depressed. They're just different granularities of that area, of that concept. So I wonder if this is pointing us in a direction of having a more level playing field between these physical experiences and emotional ones. It does seem useful at times, you know, if someone's having a panic without panic, to say, well, there's this thing called panic, and that means it's in your brain, and it's not a heart attack, and that's a useful thing. But I wondered what you thought about that. Is there a hierarchy in brain function, do you think, between emotions and physical symptoms?
I don't think that there is a clear-cut hierarchy. I do think that in that sense that I've just tried to introduce that emotions really are an abstracted version of explaining at least some of your physical symptoms. I don't think that in the explanation of what FND is, one is more important than the other. And I do think that actually this approach offers a window into appreciating how important the physical aspects of what patients experience are. So to really to start sometimes with rather simple lifestyle changes, which allow patients to refill energy resources and maybe to get a broader basis on which to operate then.
Right. Just I guess to comment quickly that you know the temporal order of which things arose sort of matters in some sense, right? That if a heart attack causes panic in somebody and vice versa, that still informs us and is helpful. But John, I don't know if you've got any comment on the functional cognitive disorder issue, or if Jeremy and Mark do as well, at all, about whether this framework has any tweaks needed specifically for it or not.
Shaking of the head next.
Yeah, different, Jeremy. Yeah, okay.
I think Johannes's answer was very good. I mean, I think just with functional cognitive disorder, I would think about things that several people have written about, including you, John, about the granularity of that concept, and that if we chuck this label of functional cognitive disorder at a very complex set of reasons why people complain of cognitive symptoms, we're probably not going to find the answer there. And that within that there's sort of higher level expectancy about and worry about dementia, for example. There's the effects of depression, effects of medication. There may be a specific issue around functional cognitive symptoms where you're turning attention onto the mechanics of thinking, a little bit like functional movement disorders. Yep.
Great. Any more questions in the audience? There's one over here, but whilst you go over there, or someone does, there's one online. From Omar Miles, your formulation of emotion concept is fascinating and almost looks like a cybernetic loop. Where would temperament and personality type be placed in this loop?
I'm not sure that I can answer that. I'm sure that there are smarter people and people who are more into how personalities work than I am. So I could think about some aspects like what kind of interactions you learn, how to interact with people, which is also dependent on how you conceptualize issues. But yeah, I don't really feel good at answering that.
I think there's a more values constructed by others rather than internally, I guess, aren't they? So yeah, great. So, Snady.
Thank you. Is that working?
Yeah, it's good.
You touched on the different kinds of adverse early life experience that might be related, and I guess one of the implications of your model is that it's that sensitive attunement between caregiver and infant might be really important in laying the foundation for sort of healthy, effective concepts. And I just wondered if you could unpick that a little bit more, those studies about the nature of the early experiences and the emotional neglect and the opportunities that might offer for prevention.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And so one thing that I did not mention earlier is that I think it's important to think about emotional neglect, especially in childhood, as it's so prevalent because it's part of every other kind of adverse life experience. So you cannot really imagine a setting which is emotionally really rich and meaningful, but then there is physical neglect present, or where is, I don't know, some kind of other adversity present. So emotional neglect just might be part of every other kind of adversity. And so it might explain, first of all, why there are so many patients with FND reporting emotional neglect, but it might also explain how the emotional neglect part of any kind of trauma or adverse life experience really is part of both how it predisposes to FND, so how you start to interact with people, how you start to interact with the world, but it might also, by the subtype of adverse life experience, then predispose to certain kinds of neuropsychiatric disorder or certain subtypes of FND. So we all know that there is research on that functional seizures are more related to sexual violence than are other types of FND, whereas maybe injuries or accidents might be more related to motor functional disorders. So I think that the overall groundwork may be just part of the emotional neglect spectrum that is part of every adversity, but that the fine-grained details of how these adversities came about may explain the other, or might be part of the explanation of the other features.
Great. So sorry for the chap just put his hand up, but if Adam, final question, then we'll have to move on to the next speaker. So thank you.
So I really enjoyed the talk. I mean, the question of to what extent our concepts are innate or acquired, of course, echoes right through the history of philosophy and psychology. So I'm wondering to what extent your talk has to revolutionize my thinking. I mean, do I really have to give up the idea that happiness, sadness, anger, and disgust are universal human emotions?
I don't want anyone to give up anything. I do think that there is a point why, for example, Ekman and colleagues found these to be core emotional flavors, let's say, or core emotions. And that is because they started at the westernized, mostly, I guess, predominantly white people and started to look for their experiences, and then just took those glasses and put them on when they looked at another set of human beings growing up in another kind of culture. So I do think that there are those flavors of emotions very prevalent. I do not think that they are like the 6 core emotions when you just look at humanity as a whole.
Perfect, thank you. And with amazing Germanic efficiency, we have 2-1. We are finishing exactly on time. This is literally amazing. So